Hey, English 1. So we are going to be looking at Chapter 2 today. We're going to read pages 17 through 27, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So go ahead and open to the beginning of Chapter 2. We are going to begin in a bunk house, and you can see the picture here on the slideshow, and we'll talk about it more in a minute. A bunk house is just going to be kind of a long room where a bunch of guys can all sleep in the same place. So here we go. Chapter 2. The bunkhouse was a long rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls, there were small square windows, and in the 4th, a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets, and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk, there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles, soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves and little vials, combs, and from the nails on the box sides, a few neckties. Near one wall, there was a black cast-iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright, dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised, the door opened, and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans, and he carried a big push-broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lenny. "The boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning." He pointed with his right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round, stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets down on the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into his box shelf and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell is this?" "I don't know," said the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. What the hell kind of bed you giving us anyways? We don't want no pants rabbits." The old swamper shifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side while he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Tell you what," he said finally. "Last guy that had this bed was a blacksmith. Hell of a nice fella, and as clean a guy as you want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate." "Then how come he got graybacks?" George was working up a slow anger. Lenny put his bindle on the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. "Tell you what," said the old swamper. "This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs. Just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals, he'd peel his boiled potatoes. And he'd take every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was. Clean. Used to dress up Sundays even when he wasn't going no place. Put on a necktie even, and then set in the bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What did you say he quit for?" The old man put the yellow can in his pocket, and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. "Why, He just quit the way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says, give me my time one night, the way a guy would. George lifted his tick and looked underneath it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately, Lenny got up and did the same with his bed. Finally, George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf, his razor and a bar of soap, his comb and a bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made up his bed, neatly with blankets. The old man said, I guess the boss will be out here in a minute. He was sure burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when we was eating breakfast and says, where the hell's them new men? And he give the stable buck hell, too. George patted a wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. Give the stable buck hell? He asked. Sure. You see, the stable buck's a nigger. Nigger, huh? Yeah, nice fella, too. Got a crooked back where a horse kicked him. The boss'll give him hell when he's mad, but the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. Got books in his room. What kind of guy is the boss? George asked. Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. I tell you know what he done Christmas? Bring a gallon of whiskey right in here and says, drink hearty, boys. Christmas comes but once a year. The hell he did. Whole gallon? Yes, sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let the nigger come in that night. Little Skinner named Smitty took after the nigger. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the nigger got him. If he could have used his feet, Smitty says he would have killed the nigger. The guy says on account the nigger's got a crooked back, Smitty can't use his feet. He paused in relish of the memory. After that, the guys went into Oops, I got caught up. Sorry. He paused in relish of the memory. After that, the guys went into Soledad and raised hell. I didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more. Lenny was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again, and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt, on each side of a square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him, and then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. Them guys just come, he said, and shuffled past the boss and out the door. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. I wrote Murray and Reddy. I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips? George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. It wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. It says right here on this slip that you was to be here for work this morning. George looked down at his feet. Bus driver give us a bum steer, he said. But we had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning. The boss squinted his eyes. Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now till after dinner. He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lenny, and Lenny nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. What's your name? George Milton. And what's yours? George said, his name's Lenny Small. The names were entered in the book. Let's see. This is the 20th. Noon the 20th. He closed the book. Where you boys been working? Up around Weed, said George. You too? To Lenny. Yeah, him too, said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. He ain't much of a talker, is he? No, he ain't. But he's sure a hell of a good worker. Strong as a bull. Lenny smiled to himself. Strong as a bull, he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in a shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, Listen, Small. Lenny raised his head. What can you do? In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. He could do anything you tell him, said George. He's a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bags, drive a cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try. The boss turned on George. Then why don't you let him answer? What you trying to pull over? George broke in loudly. Oh, I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't. But he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale. The boss deliberately put his little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted one eye nearly closed. Say, what you selling? Huh? I said, what stake you got in this guy? You taking his pay from him? No, of course I ain't. Why you think I'm selling him out? Well, I never seen a guy take so much trouble for another guy. I just like to know what your interest is. George said, he's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all right. Just ain't bright. But he can do anything you tell him. The boss turned half away. Well, God knows he don't need any brains to buck barley bags. But don't you try to put nothing over me, Milton. Got my eye on you. What'd you do in weed? Sorry. Why'd you quit in weed? Job was done, said George promptly. What kind of job? We was digging a cesspool. All right. But don't try to put nothing over, 'cause you can't get away with nothing. I've seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team. Slim? Yeah, big tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner. He turned abruptly and went to the door. But before he went out, he turned and looked for a long moment at the two men. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lenny. So you wasn't going to say a word. You was going to leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talking. Oh, damn near lost us the job. Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forgot, and I got to talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on his bunk. Now he has his eye on us. Now we got to be careful and make no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George, what you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, George said viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. Well, that was a lie, and I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door, and peered out. Say, what the hell you doing listening? The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand. At his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle, with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing in the shade a minute, scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out the wash house. You was poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody to get nosy. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lenny, then back again. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was saying. I ain't interested in nothing you was saying. Guy on a ranch don't never listen, nor he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in and sit down a minute, he said. That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall, and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss? He asked. Pretty good. Seemed all right. He's a nice fella, the swamper agreed. You gotta take him right. At that moment, a young man came into the bunkhouse. A thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. See my old man? He asked. The swamper said, He was here just a minute ago, Curly. Went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new men, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George, and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows, and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? We just come in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. George said, Suppose he doesn't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. By Christ! He's going to talk when he spoke to. What the hell are you getting into it for? We travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking helplessly to George for instruction. And you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lenny. We just come in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. George watched him out, and then turned back to the swamper. Say, what the hell's he got on his shoulder? Lenny didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight and he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George. You don't have to take after Lenny. Lenny didn't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lenny? The swamper considered. Well, tell you what, Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys, kind of like he's mad at them because he ain't a big guy. You've seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy. Sure, said George. I've seen plenty of tough little guys. But this Curly better not make no mistakes about Lenny. Lenny ain't handy, but this Curly punk is going to get hurt if he messes around with Lenny. Well, Curly's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curly jumps a big guy, licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick on somebody his own size. And maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. All right, let's stop there. We are now going to talk briefly about what's going on in this chapter. So we start in the bunkhouse, and look at the descriptions that Steinbeck gives us. It is a plain room, no frills, nothing special. Look at the description of The shelves, let's read this. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made two shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. From the nails on the box sides, a few neckties. So what does this tell you about the men who live here? Okay, it tells us that these men are simple. We're not talking about like a nice decorated room. If it was a bunch of women, it would be pretty. There'd be nice smelling things everywhere. These are guys, right? Just give me an apple box. I don't need nice shelves. I just need a shelf. Just going to put my stuff on it, and I don't have a lot of stuff. All of my belongings fit on just a couple of shelves. So it tells you a lot about the men who work here. They don't own much. And they're just kind of hard, tough guys. Okay, we get a little bit of context about Whitey, right? The guy who left. And it's interesting because it says he just left. He said he quit because of the food, but he's just like guys. They just leave. Now, think about this time period. Think about these bindle stiffs that we talked about. These are just men who go from job to job to job. They have no family. Nothing to tie them down, no responsibility. You wake up one morning, you look around, you hate everyone's ugly face, you hate the food, give me my pay, I'm out. That's how it was. So you might have a friend for a while, but eventually these people are just going to roll on out. These people don't stick around. Okay, one little detail here. You probably heard me read the word nigger, and I will admit it makes me feel a little uncomfortable to read it. But a couple of things. It is in the text, and I am a strong believer in reading the text as it is. We don't use that word anymore. There's no reason to use that word. There's no reason for you to be using it around school campus or to be using it to describe anybody that you know. We know it's a evil, mean, demeaning word. But I think as we get towards the end, it's going to be important to recognize the distinction of how this word is used. So we will come back to that as we get into one of the later chapters. But just know this. If it makes you uncomfortable, I understand. And I think that we do our best to move beyond that kind of language today. But it is describing, we're talking about the stable buck here, who is a black man, and he has a crooked back. His name is Crooks. Get it? Crooks, crooked back. And he just works in the barn. He takes care of the animals. And yes, there is a little bit of racism here in how they let him come into the bunk house during Christmas, and then they wrestled around with him. But we will also talk about some of those things later on as we get later into the story. And then we meet Curly. And Curly just seems angry. George says, what's he got on his shoulder? What chip is on his shoulder? Why is he so angry at everybody? It's an idiom that we use, that chip on your shoulder. What makes you bothered by the world, right? Okay, but he says this. He says, let the big guy talk. I want to talk to Lenny. And he looks at George and says, why are you even talking? Like, why do you even care? And George says, we travel around together. And Curly goes, oh, so it's that way, huh? You two, like, travel together? You work jobs together? You, like, look out for each other? And George is like, yeah, we stick together. And the boss said something very similar. The boss was surprised. And the boss like, why are you answering all these questions for him? Now, George lied and said, well, we're cousins, and my cousin was kicked in the head, and so he's, wah. But the point is this. The boss is surprised and shocked that these guys are together and that they care about each other. And Curly is surprised and shocked that they go around together and that they care about one another and look after one another. This is important. The boss does not understand George and Lenny, and Curly does not understand George and Lenny. And we will circle back to that a bunch as we continue. So we got the Swamper. He only has one hand. Other hand got chopped off. He's old man. We got the boss, but That's actually the last we see of the boss. He's just the big guy in charge. And then we got Curly. Curly is the boss's son. And you know when you're the boss's son, Dad's not going to fire you. You can't do anything wrong. Okay, we get the glove, and you can see here in the picture, he's got a glove on one hand. Okay, that's a little weird. We'll find out more about that in a little bit. And Curly is a boxer. The Swamper says he's pretty handy. He's good in the ring. It means he's a boxer. And he's always trying to beat up big guys. He's a little guy, and so if he beats up big guys, he looks so tough. And if he loses, then everyone feels bad for him because a big guy beat him up. So it's kind of a win-win situation for Curly and a lose-lose situation for everybody else. Well, who did Curly go after in this chapter? He didn't fight, but he got angry. And who is he going for? Lenny. Because Lenny's the big guy. So, lots more to explore and talk about, but I think we're going to call that for now. We'll finish the chapter another day. All right. Thanks for paying attention, ladies and gents. Talk to you later.